I'm recording. So I'm Jana, she, her. I'm the co-chair of Snohomish County, DSA. Jason, can you go next?
I'm Jason, he, him, and I'm in the Everett IWW and SnoCo DSA.
Michael?
I'm Michael, he, him, and I'm on the Medicare for All Committee at SnoCo DSA.
Samuel?
I'm Samuel, he, him. I'm on the steering committee, at-large member of Snohomish County DSA.
Scott?
I'm Scott, he, him, and I am wondering, if we're going to have, are we going to have recordings of all of these? Because I didn't record my Marxism or my Leninism talks. Should we go back and do those at some other point?
Yeah, I think we can. I mean, we weren't doing it on Zoom, but I think it'd be a great idea for us to do it on in future Zoom calls, and then we can share them. But yeah, if you ever wanted to record, we'll talk about that afterwards. Michelle and Hayden?
Remember to unmute this time. Michelle, she, her, I'm one of our chapter's co-chairs, and I'm enjoying a nice cup of coffee out of my cute little Powell's City of Book mugs with a cute little cat on it.
Hello, Hayden Jones, he, him, former at-large steering committee member for SnoCo DSA. I'm currently doing some work with our COVID working group to help arrange food drive action while we're all in this COVID situation.
Bob?
Hi, I'm Bob, he, him. I'm a member of the Everett IWW invited by Jason.
Diana?
Hi, I'm Diana Jaramillo, and I'm with SnoCo DSA, and happy to be here.
Great. Andy, I'd put you on mute because there was some background sound, but would you be able to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, my name's Andy, he, him, and this is my first call with this group.
Great, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then when you're not talking, would you be able to mute your phone? That way I don't have to unmute you.
Sure thing.
Thanks. And Randall, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Randall. I'm with DSA, he, him.
Great. It's exciting for everyone to be here. I'm going to share some slides, and I think we're going to be doing a presentation and then doing some discussion questions after that. May or may not do breakout rooms. We can decide what feels better then. All right. Oops.
Okay, should I take it away or?
Yeah, please take it away. And then
Okay.
if you have questions as we go ahead and put them in the chat.
Yes, please do. We'll stop at periodic moments to try to answer any questions that may come up with something that's been presented. Welcome to our third version of Socialist Caffeine, a political education endeavor by our chapter in Snohomish County of DSA. We've had a good one on Marxism, on Leninism. We've had some interesting political education on the French Commune. Thank you again, Scott, for doing that. I missed it, unfortunately. And Daniel on solidarity, among others. So this is just an ongoing effort to try to educate us all and give us some perspective on where we've been, where we might go, and raise questions in everyone's mind. I hope we get some disagreement today. I'm going to be objective. I'm not a scholar of syndicalism by any means, but I'm going to try to present you with an overview. So welcome one and all. Let's begin first. Well, let's begin with 1847 in the Communist Manifesto. This was the attitude towards the state. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Obviously, not a laudatory exclamation there. There's some real disparaging of what the state is and what it does. So let's begin. I'm going to quote from a, pardon me, I'm old, so I have to take off my glasses to read sometimes. But let's begin by defining syndicalism. What is it? This is from the Oxford English Dictionary. Syndicalism, also called anarcho-syndicalism or autonomous Marxism, is a movement that advocates direct action by the working class to abolish the capitalist order, including the state, and to establish in its place a social order based on workers organized in productive units. Okay? So who were the major influences on syndicalism? Again, syndicalism is not a theory as such. It is a method of action. I'm going to kind of do this chronologically, if I may. Well, let me read a statement first before we begin on that. I want to kind of give you an overview of what you'll be listening to for part of this time period, and I'm hoping we have a lot of period for discussion. Syndicalism, based on the French term for unions, syndicat, arose first in France during the 1830s and 1840s. Though never an ideology, but more a plan for independent working class self-organization and action, it drew from Marx, socialism, and Bakunin, anarchism. It was also heavily influenced by the French thinkers and activists Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, famous for his statement, "Property is theft," and later in the early 1900s, Georges Sorel in his Reflections on Violence. Syndicalism was important in Spain, Italy, and Latin America. The Russian Revolution of 1905 was a great spur to its growth, especially the development of Soviets, which were workers' and peasants' councils, and soldiers. After World War I, the movement to spur social revolution through workers' councils became very important in Italy. That's where Antonio Gramsci first began. In Germany, where Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht fulfilled their missions, and in Spain, partly as a democratic response to what was perceived as the statism of the Bolsheviks in Russia. In the US and Canada, the IWW in the US, and the IWW, rather more widely known as the One Big Union movement in Canada, were the leading, if not official, syndicalist organizations. During the 1930s, several major strikes to create the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, were syndicalist in nature, if not in name. And I'm thinking specifically of San Francisco, the Longshore Strike, Minneapolis, the Teamsters Strike, and Akron, the Rubber Workers Strike. All of them, coincidentally, taking place in 1934, before the actual formation of the CIO. So let's begin. If you can go back toward the top, Jana, would be appreciated. There we go. No. Okay. So let's go kind of chronologically here. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon was a French reformer and activist. He's been named sometimes by some folks as the father of anarchism, but he proposed an anti-capitalist movement, which he termed mutualism. If you remember, Daniel brought up at the general meeting earlier this month the idea of solidarity. Mutualism is another way to express that. Mikhail Bakunin, a leader of the anarchist movement and a leading member of the International Working Men's Association, which was the first international of workers, violently opposed to the state and argued that workers needed to independently organize, not through elections, but independently organized to overthrow the state. Marx, in his tradition, was somewhat ambivalent. They were willing to engage the state through electoral means, but also he made it clear in numerous writings, specifically in Das Kapital, that with independent working class action that would lead to the overthrow of the capitalist system. Now, Bakunin and Marx had their ins and outs. Actually, they all did. None of them fully agreed with one another, but they all emphasized that independent working class action was going to be necessary to overthrow and to rid ourselves of capitalist exploitation and institute a socialist or egalitarian or mutualist, in Proudhon's language, organization of society. Georges Sorel was a leading, if ambivalent, exponent of syndicalism when he published Reflections on Violence in 1908. An interesting side effect, and we need to bear in mind that syndicalism is not an ideology as such. It's not a full-blown theory. It's a method of action. And Sorel's ideas on violence were that some violence is good, some is not. State violence is forced upon the working class, upon the citizenry through its power. The state is based on power. The state is based on force. But he also introduced an idealist concept. He was not a materialist like were Marx or Bakunin, or even to some extent Proudhon. But Sorel introduced the idea that myths are important to guide the working class as it achieves its victory over the capitalist system. Two aspects about Sorel. His ideas, because of his mythology and the idea of a myth of violence, the righteousness of the myth of working class violence, was adopted by the fascist movement, especially in France, the Action Française, but later incorporated into Mussolini's fascism and others. So that's kind of a wobbly point on Sorel's part. In the early 1970s, late 1960s, early 70s, Sorel became reintroduced to student activists in SDS and others and became incorporated into part of the New Left. It was especially adopted, and I had direct experience with this, among Latin American activists. I was attending a Jesuit university at that time, among whom, excuse me, were a number of activists who were going to be heading back to their homes, their home country, Chile, Panama, Argentina, and taking these ideas with them. And there was a real emphasis on his distinction about good violence and bad violence, what is just violence, what is not. And there were major arguments among the Latin American activists, especially about what is appropriate, what is not. So just as a kind of give you a little historical perspective on how these ideas have evolved over time. So let's go forward one more if we could. What are the major principles of syndicalism? And I'm drawing this from a major study that was done in the journal Le Travail, Labor, which is a Canadian publication. And it was called One Big Union in International Perspective, Revolutionary Industrial Union, 1900 to 1925. Appeared in 1981. I can send people that link if they want to have it, but these are the 5 major principles that organizations throughout the world who proclaim syndicalism have identified as their central principles. One is federalism over centralism. Federalism is the grouping together of independent organizations, trade unions, to take over the government and operate the government, the administration of things as opposed to the administration of people. Centralism was identified with the unitary state, the monarchies, the empires, the so-called bourgeois democracies that centralized power at the top. and they wanted to do away with that because it had been used as a tool to defeat the labor movement, to defeat progressive actions wherever they might appear. The second, in line with that, was an opposition to political parties. It was known in many of these countries, in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia even, the political parties sold out to the ruling class, in effect. Give you some examples. In the United Kingdom, in England especially, the Trades Union Congress, which was formed early on to bring all the unions together in England, found themselves basically without universal suffrage, especially women, and that they were at the mercy of political parties, and people they would send to Parliament, for example, would then become more concerned with pursuing their own personal agenda of re-election, of making a difference in Parliament, and not sticking to the values for which they were elected. So there was an opposition to political parties, and the state would in fact impose injunctions, would bring in federal, regional security police, the army, to put down strikes, progressive assemblies, and the like. Third, the chief revolutionary weapon, therefore, since we're not going to engage in the electoral system in most places, is the general strike. It's the workers taking action on their own behalf, which can strike at the power of the capitalist class and their political allies, and overturn them. Finally, 4, a federal economic organization as opposed to the state. Again, the idea was that workers, through their unions in their particular industrial situations, would come together to work cooperatively as opposed to a unitary state that said one size fits all and took advantage excuse me, I'm sorry, of the working class. And the unions were seen fine as the building blocks of a post-capitalist society. Now, not unions necessarily as we know them. We're talking here about what Jonathan Rosenblum talked about, social unionism, unions with a strategy to increase democratic participation by its membership and to exert their power in the economy and in society as a whole. Let's go to the next slide if we could. Oh, my medicine always makes me cough right after I take it. I apologize. The two methods were direct action by the working class. Now, direct action can mean a number of things. It can be a slowdown. It can be a work to rule, which slows down the production process. It can be a strike. It can be a sit-down strike, one of the most revolutionary tools introduced by the auto workers in the 1930s, where you actually seize the property by remaining in the factory and not allowing production to proceed. It could also be a general strike, which is the main tool which was seen as the way to end capitalist domination, through the mass or the general strike. Rosa Luxemburg, for example, in Germany, has some major and important writings on this topic, how it might proceed. But again, it's not a seizure of power, it's not a coup d'etat, it's a mass uprising of workers who strike to end production and bring down the capitalist class and reform society going forward. This has taken a number of different things, and we'll go through some of that. So, thank you, Janet. Let's go ahead to some of the, any questions first? I don't want to get too far ahead of myself.
I muted a couple of you, so you might need to unmute yourself.
Or you can put them in chat, either way. Well, that's a resounding silence, so I guess let's go forward. Okay. The initial spread of syndicalism was important in Spain, Italy, and Latin America, to name a few. One of the reasons, and the reason syndicalism became important in many countries around the world, because it arose in situations where workers had no direct contact with the current government, whatever it might be. An emperor, a king, a bourgeois democracy. They either didn't have any access to suffrage for a number of reasons. In many cases, the unions were banned outright in Germany under Bismarck, for example, and in many countries around the world. Italy at the time, as we're speaking, which is the middle to late 19th century, wasn't even a fully formed country at that time. It was still a number of ducalities, principalities, kingships, and the like. It was only after Garibaldi and others and the Risorgimento that brought Italy together as a country. So in Spain, one of the leading, and syndicalism really grew strongest where anarchism was strongest. And there will be another session coming up, I'm not certain when, but in the near future, I hope, on the whole subject of anarchism, so I don't want to get too deeply into it. But the Federation of Anarchists, the FAI, the Federation of Spanish Anarchists, was very important in bringing together workers and peasants in Spain to push for worker independent action, again, because they had no access to governmental power. In Italy, the same thing. Even after its unification, the major, even though industry was stunted in the late 19th century, the peasants rose up in large numbers and led peasants' leagues through direct action seeking reform on their own, land reform, agrarian reform, and better working conditions for the large majority of the population at that time, especially in southern Italy. And in Latin America, some of the earliest growth, and in a syndicalist direction, but in any kind of direction, was in Chile with the miners. You had tin, lead, and especially copper miners who organized early as a syndicalist, anti-political, non-political workers' organization to push forward basic social change. In Argentina, you had the same thing. Before it was captured by the Peronists in the 1940s during World War II, under one Perón, you had the growth of syndicalist unions, especially in the food processing. Their two major exports at the time were beef, in fact, they still may be, beef and wheat. And in the food processing, manufacturing industries, unions became very powerful and very independent. You also had the same thing occurring in other countries and that we might be more familiar with. The Trades Union Congress in the UK, for example, never identified itself with a political party. It made sure that it was independent. And so it was syndicalist in name, or in fact, if not in name. In Ireland, James Larkin and James Connolly led the first major strike by workers in Ireland in 1911 in the docks with the Transport and General Workers Union. And James Connolly later went on, he's famous for being a participant and a leader of the Easter Rebellion in 1916, which attempted to establish an independent socialist republic for Ireland and was executed for that. He's a real hero in my opinion, but again, where people were locked out and denied the opportunity to have a say in their government, either through suffrage or any other means of participation, syndicalism grew and became very important. The Russian Revolution of 1905 introduced a new element. And I think the best source for this, for the history of the 1905 revolution, was by one of the leaders of that revolution, Leon Trotsky. And it was the establishment of what they called Soviets, workers and peasants councils. Now, Soviets also played a part in the 1917 revolution, but included the returning, deserting soldiers as well. So you had worker, peasants, and military councils, and they created a system. They grew so powerful, they created a system of dual power. So you had the formal structure of government still existing, at first under the Tsar, and in 17 later under the transitional government under the Social Democrats, Kerensky and the like. But you had even as powerful an organization in these workers, peasants, and soldiers councils, which wielded power and directed in some of the major cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, the real day-to-day life of the citizens. You also had the Socialist Revolutionary, the SR party, organizing peasants' unions throughout the country. So this was a real development of direct worker action, worker power, developing and actually, for a time, held dual power and really counterbalanced the formal political system that had been heretofore and presaged the new society they were hoping to build that would be coming. Can we get another slide, please? After World War I, a lot of things changed. Syndicalism became perceived as a method of action and a highlight of worker action in response, at least along the left, in response to what was perceived as the centralism of the Bolshevik regime in Russia. So there was a real pushback that the Bolshevik regime had taken too much power on itself and was ruling by diktat, not through democratic means. So in Italy, where industry had now begun to grow, and thanks largely to the war, there were major strikes and workers' actions in the two major industrial cities of Italy, and Antonio Gramsci was a major player in these. He later became the head of the Italian Communist Party, the PCI. But in Milan and in Torino, I guess if you're Italian, there were major actions, and they were part of what was known as council communism, where workers' councils took over the factories, essentially took over the operation of the city and regional governments for a time until they were put down by the state. In Germany, because of the failure of the Social Democratic Party to adequately oppose the war efforts of the previous Kaiser regime, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, with the Spartacist movement, rejected the centralism of the Bolshevik regime and advocated for council communism, workers' councils coming together to overtake and to overthrow the regime and institute a socialist democracy in the German states. In Spain, again, you had the Civil War, and there was a real conflict between the FAI, the anarchists, and the various left parties. The left parties, when they overthrew the monarchical regime in 1934, coalesced and formed a popular front. The anarchists generally stayed aloof from that because they did not want to be involved in the political machinations of running government. They wanted workers' direct control. It was only after Franco roused the army and brought in his troops through the Falange to wage war on the Republic in Spain that the anarchists joined with the Popular Front in Spain to fight back. So that's just an example of some of the things that were occurring at this time. Let's move to the next slide if we could. Okay. Let's talk about North America, a little closer to home and maybe more familiar to many of you. There were two major, if not official, syndicalist organs in the US and Canada. In the US, it was the IWW, which we all know, the Wobblies. It was also the IWW in Canada, but it became largely throughout the provinces known as the One Big Union movement. Again, in the preamble to the Constitution of the IWW in the United States, when it was founded in Chicago in 1905, Bill Haywood, coming from the United Federation of Miners, calls it the Continental Congress of the Working Class. And again, it was based on, in large part, with some discrepancies, on the model of the organization of the United Federation of Miners and the Western Federation of Miners, which did not participate in electoral action, but resolved itself to winning their battles through united direct action by workers themselves. In Canada, the One Big Union movement followed a similar path. They did not engage with the Liberals and the Conservatives, the two leading parties at that time. There was no Social Democratic Party. There was the beginnings of one in Saskatchewan and Alberta with the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF, led by Tommy Douglas, but that's a later story. It later became the New Democratic Party, which is the NDP we know now. A number of actions took place, and one of the things, in order to ensure the direct action of the working class, they always wanted to keep the strike as a weapon. So the IWW often in their strikes would say that we will not sign a contract with the employer because we want the operation, we want the option to be able to take concerted action at any particular time when we deem it so warranted. In Canada, the same thing was the case. They would not sign working contracts, written contracts with employers, but kept their options open. They led, in fact, we've all heard of the Seattle General Strike, in which the IWW played a minor role. But in Canada, the Winnipeg strike was in large measure led by the syndicalists of the IWW in Canada, and took over the city for a number of days and won major demands before it too ended. Now, during the 1930s, you had the beginning of organization of industrial workers. The AFL, the primary union federation, American Federation of Labor, since 1886, when it was founded, directly represented craft workers, so trades workers, and did a good job in many cases in that respect. However, they ignored the immigrant, the unskilled workers who were staffing and producing the wealth of this country in the major industries, steel, and a number of other places. So there began a movement to really concentrate on creating industrial unions, uniting all workers in a particular industry in the same union, not divided into crafts. So for example, originally in the steel industry, you might have I'm not sure what they all did, but the puddlers, you might have carpenters, you might have machinists, you might have the like, and they were all organized as separate crafts and didn't really work one with the other. This couldn't go on in the minds of many progressives in the labor movement. So in San Francisco, and again, these all happened in 1934, you had the longshoremen go out for hiring hall rights, that you didn't have to show up en masse in what was called a star gang at the docks each morning, only to have a foreman say, I'm picking you, I'm picking you, I'm picking you, no, you're out, go away. And you go home, you had no work. They wanted the right to control their own hiring halls, and it was a bloody fight. It lasted 3 or 4 days. They held a general strike in San Francisco under the communist leadership of Henry Bridges. Well, under the leadership of Henry Bridges, who happened to be a member of the American Communist Party. And they won. In Minneapolis, there was a strike because the Teamsters, not just truck drivers and car drivers, but horse-drawn wagons and stuff who did all the deliveries, were being locked out by the owners of the major companies in the area, and they struck back. And they did it as a wildcat in opposition to their own national Teamster leadership who opposed them. They introduced a number of new methods of fighting, flying squads to make sure that if an employer or the police showed up somewhere, they could bring 200, 300 workers to that site to stop them, and then move to another site as that became a hot spot. Again, they were successful, led by 2 brothers. I can't remember one's name, but Farrell Dobbs was one of the leaders. They were Trotskyists. In Akron, you had the rubber workers, a fairly brand new industry, trying to organize for the first time. And again, in 1934, they took to the streets and shut down the entire city and the region. No more tires being produced, no more rubber products of any kind being produced until they won their demands. They were led by a charismatic religious leader at that time, A.J. Musty, who was also working in concert with what was known then as the Workers' Party, which was an outgrowth of the Trotskyist movement in the United States. And again, they were successful. Now, this was 1934. The Committee on Industrial Organization, led by John L. Lewis of the mine workers, which had been a proto-industrial union for a number of years, and was still evolving in that respect. They formed in 1933, or 1935, but they did not become the Congress of Industrial Organizations until after these victories, when they created that major counterpoint to the AFL. And so you had dual power in the labor movement for a number of years until 1955 when they reunited. Next slide, please. This is an example, and it's just one among many. And this is an old example. This is actually from the 1920s. So it's really kind of out of date. If you go to the iww.org website and look it up, you can find a renewed model, which includes aerospace and the like, and makes it more real. But this was their one vision of how you might organize society. Now, this is a radical departure from the current way we organize our political society. There would be no Senate, there would be no House of Representatives, probably wouldn't be a president. There would be a steering committee. The unions would organize around industrial units and delegate authority to make recommendations on how to structure the economy and move forward to reorganize society as they went ahead. So this is just one example, but it's a nice graphic representation of how you might reorganize society in opposition to what currently exists. Okay, next one, if we could. Again, here's the preamble to the IWW Constitution in 1905, where it calls the organization, I know you can't read this, it's too small, but you can find it again on the IWW.org website. And it was the Constitutional Convention of the Working Class, rejecting all political party organizations and relying on direct action by workers themselves to recreate society and do away with the old. Let's go forward if we could. Okay. Well, first of all, are there any questions so far from what you've heard? I'd be happy to try to answer them. I can't necessarily say I will.
Hi, Hayden. Just wondering, I've heard that the industrial workers of the world in the early part of the 20th century was more successful on the West Coast than on the East Coast, because I've heard partially because industry was less developed. Can you speak to that or why that was the case?
I'm not sure. Well, okay, thank you, Hayden. Good question. I'm not certain that's actually authentic. I would say that you had some major strikes in the textile industries, especially on the East Coast. Originally, many of them led by the workers themselves. The 1909 strike in the New York sewing trades was a major strike led by the women in the industry itself, even without a union. What came from it was a major union, the Ladies Garment Workers Union, among others. And they won some major successes through that strike. You had the Patterson strike, you had the, oh dear, I'm missing one here, senior moment. But anyway, so there was a lot of effort on the East Coast. In the South, however, they tried to organize textile industries, which really boomed following the end of World War I, and were unsuccessful in those attempts. But that's a very complicated story. On the West Coast, on the other hand, you had major organization. We didn't have factories as such like they had on the East Coast, for example, or in Chicago, but you had resource extraction industries in lumber, in fishing, in fish processing, in food processing, and there were a number of major organizational victories here on the West Coast through the work of the IWW that really built the organization. It was with the coming of World War I and the repression that followed that, and the Red Scare immediately following that, that really served to be their death knell. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
And I guess
we're not dead.
Scott, it looks like you're next.
Yep. So you mentioned the dual power thing. Obviously, there was dual power present in the 1917 revolution, but you also mentioned the 1905 revolution, and it almost sounded like you implied that dual power was present at that time, but my understanding was that the 1905 revolution was a major flop and a failure.
yes and no would be my characterization. Yes, it failed. The revolution failed. It was put down by the government. The Tsar massacred people in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, and it was shut down effectively in that respect. However, the point was, people saw for the first time that the creation of these workers and peasants councils offered a glimpse of a possibility they could organize efficiently and sufficiently to contest for power. And that was, I believe, was carried forward in 1917.
Michelle?
Yeah, so I just had some further questions about the Minneapolis strike and just wondering your thoughts on the characterization of it, Randall. I was recently reading an excerpt from James P. Cannon's History of American Trotskyism, and he writes in detail like a whole chapter on the Minneapolis strike. And he really talks about how, I mean, the Trotskyists were coming from New York to Minneapolis and really putting all of their money and effort into supporting the strike in Minneapolis. But it really seemed to me like the Trotskyists were acting like a party and that they were really focusing on the political education and the development of the workers and supporting them in that sense. And so if there is I was wondering if you would like fully characterize the Minneapolis strike as syndicalist when you consider the involvements of the Trotskyists and the American Workers' Party.
Well, again, yes and no. None of these fits a perfect model, but I would argue that, yes, even though they were representing a political viewpoint, and let's remember, the Trotskyist movement was very new. It had only been created since 1926, 1927, with the Stalinist expulsion of Trotsky and left communists from the Bolshevik Party from ruling positions of power in the Soviet Union. So it was beginning to take on an international focus. But again, it was fairly new. I mean, it was brand new, really, just like DSA is. And so they were pushing a certain political line, with which I mostly agree, but they had to appeal to the workers and make the workers feel that they had the opportunity to engage in the assumption of power, which they did. By taking over the city for a number of days and successfully winning most of their major demands, despite the pressure of the state. The state of Minnesota and the federal government as well, to block them, to put them down. So it was a mixed bag. But again, I would say they relied really on the direct action and discipline of the workers themselves, and that was paramount. I know that James P. Cannon has his own viewpoint as a leader of the Trotskyist movement here in the United States. Of course, he would want to put that forward, but I think if you read the actual written product from the Dobbs brothers on the strike itself, I think you'll see in more detail. It was very worker-originated, worker-oriented, worker-directed action against the employers in the area.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really fair assessment and characterization of what was going on in Minneapolis. It was something I'd just been recently reading and just wanted to ask to, kind of expand my understanding on what was going on there. And syndicalism is still pretty new to me, so just very helpful.
Thanks, Michelle. I just want to give an opportunity. Anyone on the phone have questions? All right, we'll have more time for discussion later.
Okay, well, let's move back to Europe then and try to update it a little. Especially following World War II, with the Soviet liberation of Eastern Europe, by and large, from the horrors of Nazism, people didn't always take kindly to the substitution of one authoritarian or totalitarian regime imposed upon them, at first welcomed by force, but later reinforced by force in their communities. So in Hungary in 1956, you had an uprising, especially at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The new premier, or new general secretary, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a speech, a supposedly secret speech, which didn't remain secret very long, in which he really tore down the Stalinist legacy that had led to the Soviet Union through about 40 years of terror, and was continuing and didn't seem like it would soon subside. And he took pains to delineate many of the crimes, as he called them, that Stalin, and I believe he was correct, that Stalin had perpetrated on the citizenry in the name of socialism and working class solidarity. So in 1956, once this became more broadly known, workers and citizens generally in Hungary rose up against the Soviet domination in what became known as the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. This took a number of forms: street fighting, workers' councils were formed because under the Hungarian Soviet-directed regime, independents were not, or unions were not independent. They were part of the state machinery. And so workers' councils were formed in factories throughout Hungary to try to bring democracy and democratic planning. They were not against planning, but they wanted democratic planning in their economy. It was put down by the arrival of Russian tanks in about a month later. But it was a brave attempt and a first bold attempt on the part of workers to in the Soviet network to push back and to speak for themselves and seek power on their own in one fashion or another. You then had, moving on, you then had uprisings. I'm going to introduce one here. Well, actually, I'll do it right now. The next major uprising, there were a couple of minor uprisings in Poland in the interregnum. There had been one in Germany in 1953, East Germany, against the United Democratic Republic. But in France, 1968 was a rather remarkable year. We remember for a number of things here in this country: the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., rising strikes against the participation of the U.S. in imperialist war in Vietnam, the melee, the police riot that occurred in Chicago in August of that year, but also the assassination of another liberal anti-war Democrat, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Robert F. Kennedy. So it was a strange year, not only in the United States, but around the world. Again, you had the Tet Offensive at the beginning of that year, which showed that the movement of the people in Vietnam against the imperialist powers and the puppet regime in South Vietnam, even though they suffered heavy blows during the Tet Offensive, really shook up the entire makeup of the war as it went on its way. In May of 1968, you had a major uprising, and it would be an interesting subject of discussion to discuss the French educational system, but this is neither the time nor the place. But students went out on the streets against what they considered heavy-handed and mind-numbing educational practices on the part of the elite in that country. Reminiscent really of what had happened here in this country in 1964 with the free speech movement at Berkeley. They were joined, they were so reasonable being unreasonable that they imagined the impossible. And in fact, the workers in France under the leadership or organized in the CGT, the Confédération Générale du Travail, General Federation of Labor, in France, which was a syndicalist organization and had been since its beginning in the early 1900s, where it too rejected engagement with any political party and concentrated on direct action by workers in their factories and workplaces. They joined with the students over a period of several weeks in a general strike, which just totally shut down. You think you think we have a shutdown here in the United States? They had a shutdown there in France. It shut the economy down. In fact, President de Gaulle at the time had to temporarily relocate himself to Germany to avoid what was considered possible assassination attempts against him. He later returned. There was a split in the labor movement. The CGT had a counterpart which allied itself with the PCF, the Parti Communiste Français, the French Communist Party, called the CGTU. And they agreed after negotiations with members of the established government, the Gaullist regime, to return to work. And then you had the CGT gradually fold in as well, which brought the street fighting and the demonstrations and the protest to an essential end. But it was a real possibility here. You had major young workers coming out of the universities with factory workers organized in the General Confederation of Labor, street battling it out with security forces, the Compagnie de République Sécurité, the CRS, in vicious street battles in Paris, and not only in Paris, but around the country, seeking to liberate society, French society, and create a new order. They didn't win, but I think one of their slogans on the right-hand side, you'll see it. It was the début d'une lutte prolongée. It was the beginning of a long struggle. That, my friends, comrades, fellow workers, is the struggle we are engaged in now. Let's move forward. Poland, a major case. Again, none of these models really fit a perfect diagram. There are always ins and outs and tweaks and whatever in each of them. But in 1981, workers in Gdańsk, the major shipbuilding port, seaport of Poland, had had enough. They had no rights, they had no voice. They were, again, subsumed under government-led trade unions that did not represent them, but represented the Communist Party in Poland. And they said, enough is enough. And they held wildcat strikes. And it took over the nation. Martial law was declared and was later rescinded because the people in the country rose up in support of solidarity, Solidarność in Polish, and won amazing victories in bringing down the communist regime as it as it existed in Poland. Now, in their origins, it was strictly worker organized, worker directed. There were no political parties except the Communist Party, and they were not about to work with them. So by definition, it had to be a syndicalist movement. One of the major differences in the Polish situation is the enormous influence of the Catholic Church. Poland is a heavily Catholic, once the Jews removed in the 30s and 40s, in Poland, and there was a close alliance between the two to push the government, the existing government, out of power and institute a new regime. So within 10 years, Solidarity had moved beyond its syndicalist origins and had become a political party with various levels of success. Success first with the election of Lech Wałęsa as president of the new government, and not so much success going forward, where you now have a right-wing bourgeois government in control of Polish society. So, but again, another example of worker-directed action that can have a major effect in a society, and in fact overturn that society and begin the creation of a new form of social organization. Okay. So any questions on any of that right away? Okay, these are just some questions I threw out. I'm not sure they're necessarily the best questions to ask, but I think we need to really discuss this. We have in our chapter and in our communities and battled back and forth is which is more important, electoral politics or direct organizing. And so my question to you is, which is more important? I mean, what seems to be the most important? Is it direct action by workers? Will it produce better results than electoral work? How do we better achieve workers' control? Is it direct action or legislation? There are arguments both ways. Will syndicalism bring direct democracy better than the current representative system? And I am very eager to hear comrades' thoughts.
Okay. I can, I could, ask questions and, talk about what you've provided, but I actually had a question about Hungary. My understanding is that it started out all well and good, as you were describing, but that the situation quickly became much more complicated, and that their demands became where reactionary elements started to stand up and start for calling for the freedom of political prisoners that were high-ranking officers under Horthy, which I'm sure you're aware was a very very reactionary regime.
He worked hand in glove with Hitler, so yeah.
Yep. And but yeah, my understanding is that it started out great, but then quickly became not so great. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, shortly. Yes, that's a good characterization, really. But it also led to a glimpse of what could come in the future. So you had a major liberalization in the 1970s, leading up, and the early 1980s, leading up to the dissolution of the communist regime in Hungary on the part of the left. So it did have, but yes, you were right. There were reactionary elements in Poland as well in their efforts. There were reactionary elements that hit the streets in support of the Gaullist regime in May and June of 1968 in France. So you're always going to have that. But again, I think the more important lesson is you really had the glimmers of hope on how we can create a new society. And here is some real demonstration of possibilities of how that might occur. So I hope that answers some of your question, Scott, but go ahead, what you were going to say.
Oh, yeah. I was speaking specifically about the Hungarian Revolution, but yeah, you are quite correct that you're always going to have reactionary elements in in any kind of newly formed socialist society. But yeah, I was referring specifically to the Hungarian Revolution of 56, I believe it was.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Michael?
I'm not sure that I have a question, but I have a kind of a general thought for you, Randall, and then I have a question. In terms of your what is better, direct action or working with the legislative process, one of the things that you see, at least in our history, since the 60s, has been that direct action has been very effective. It's been very effective in the sense of it has helped to mobilize grassroots organizations and groups of people like the Black Panthers, Black Lives Matter, the Occupy movement, the Dakota Access pipeline protest. Those events, which are basically a form of direct action, have helped to crystallize focus and inspired a lot of people in the left and progressive movement, and have also resulted in many, if not most cases, of brutal suppression by the state. It's really unfortunate that movements like the Occupy movement, which kind of fell apart from the inside because it didn't really have any kind of structure or ideological focus to hold it together, was one of the most inspiring and also one of the most threatening things that to the capitalists that has happened in a long time. I think since the Black Panthers, which were deeply, deeply threatening. So the idea of direct action really seems to be appealing, and it also helps to illuminate the increasing fomenting of that momentum in the United States, where sooner or later something's just going to happen. You're going to have some kind of action. The recent teacher strikes over the past couple of years are clear examples of when people get really fed up and they really start organizing and getting together, they are going to affect change. And obviously the state or the legislation is not going to do it for them. They're going to have to do it themselves. So just that observation that as we go on, looking at the history and looking at the moments of when direct action really begins to produce something, that our culture and country is really ripe for something like that, is on the one hand very hopeful. I also wonder, and here's the question part of my my little rumination here. Do you think that it is always, that it is inevitable, or it is always necessary for violence to accompany this kind of direct action? We've had, in a number of the strikes over the course of American history, there have been some that have been certainly accompanied by violence, and there have been others that have not. You know, I'm thinking of the garbage workers strike, and that strike that occurred back in the early 1900s. I'm not sure if it was the garment workers, but there was that big fire in which they struck after this. There was this huge fire in a garment factory.
Right, 1911, the triangle.
Right. Yes. So what do you think about that question of violence and direct action, and are they necessarily do they necessarily go hand in hand, or can direct action, actually make substantive change without having to resort to violence?
That is an age-old question.
I like the age-old questions.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty aged, so
Right.
let me take a stab at it. I don't have an answer for you.
Yeah.
I think you spoke to the Occupy movement. I think that's important. It's always upsetting to the ruling class when we threaten their property rights and occupying public spaces. Let's go back to 36 in Flint, when the workers sat down in the factories. They were taking over the property of the capitalist class, and
Right.
they were not to budge until they won their demands. And by God, they did.
Yes.
Not without some effort. The teacher strike. Let's remember, every one of those major teacher strikes was illegal. It was a wildcat strike. So they were willing to break the law to make their demand, to win their demands, and by God, they won them. Now, Frederick Douglass, I think it was, who said that power gives nothing without a demand. But he also made it clear that power will be willing to fight back, to take back what it fears it would lose. And we need to be prepared for that. I don't have an answer for that. We just need to remember that. Let me give an example from recent times. The other 9/11, September 1973, Chile. Salvador Allende and the United Front in Chile brought together the Communist and Socialist Party, a number of other left organizations and citizens organizations in a peaceful election to remake Chilean society. It lasted 3 years. I mean, there was obviously some pushback. You had the famous Mother's March, or banging tin pots. It was put together by the factory owners to embarrass the Allende regime. But it all came crashing to a halt with the United States help, sponsorship of CIA, Henry Kissinger, and the like, and the vicious attack by the Pinochet, what became the Pinochet regime, the Chilean armed forces, to bring down the government by violence and bloodshed, which they did. So that possibility exists. And so people threw up their hands in despair. Oh my God, there is no peaceful road to socialism. I don't give up hope, but I'm realistic enough to expect that if we make powerful inroads on this system, the powers that be will not be afraid to fight back as viciously as they believe they must. So.
Thank you very much.
Looks like Evan's up next.
Yeah. So thank you for allowing me to have a question. So I guess one of my kind of questions, you kind of touched on it already with the kind of the talk about, I think, the Chile you were discussing earlier, and whether or not syndicalism is an option. My one worry is, besides outside forces, there's also the element of other socialists getting in the way of other socialists. And I think it was Oscar Wilde who once said, and I get what he means when he says this, the problem with socialism is that it takes up too many evenings. And that kind of speaks to a sense, because three examples come to mind. One was the Catalonian revolt, because one of the reasons a lot of anarchist syndicalists fell is because the Communist Party, according to George Orwell, when he was fighting there, he said a lot of the Communist Party used propaganda against anarchist syndicalists to kind of essentially unite the country, to essentially throw them in jail And then in return, Francisco Franco was able to reorganize and throw the rest of them in jail. And that kind of happened also with the Black Panthers. Their organization kind of collapsed from the within inside. And there was also a workers' revolt actually for Hershey, because Hershey had his workers revolt, not revolt, but essentially lock themselves inside the factory. And what ended up happening is a bunch of the dairy workers got mad because their milk was just sitting and spoiling. So they ended up storming the factory and essentially beating up on their own comrades. So I guess the question slash a comment I have is, can it work in the sense that we can get everyone on the same page? Because there's always going to be that philosophical difference on how to do something. And if you get close to something, besides the outside forces, is there examples besides Chile where you noticed that other socialists kind of joined in on that syndicalist avenue and propelled us forward instead of backward?
Good question, Evan. I'm not sure I have a cogent response, but I would say I'd like to speak a little bit about the Spanish situation.
I figured, but I just thought I'd ask.
I'm not that, I was somewhat familiar with the Hershey situation. But again, I think it's a matter of we need to build the widespread political education in our communities so that people recognize who the real enemy here is. The dairy farmers, apparently, as you indicated, and I'm going with your delineation of what transpired, took it upon themselves to then fight back against the factory workers producing the chocolate, in defense of their own interests, of course. But the real enemy was not the workers inside the factory. The real enemy was the family that owned Hershey's. Okay, I'm not sure if they're still the Hershey family, but anyway. So we need to try to help overcome that. And if something like that is to occur, other members of the community in support of the factory workers need to show up and stand in solidarity and make the case as to why this should not occur. You have anger, we hear your grievances, but you're directing it against the wrong enemy. Turn it against the family that runs the Hershey company. Don't turn it against the workers who are trying to make a decent living in the factory. Let me go back to Spain, if I may, for just a brief second. My take on that, and you're talking about homage to Catalonia, I'm assuming. Okay. Orwell was part of an organization called POUM, the Party Obrero de I don't know Spanish that well. Anyway, the Unified Marxist Party of Workers. A Trotskyist organization, anti-Stalinist, in Spain, which was quite large, but not well organized. So they became an early, along with the anarchists, when the Stalinists, Hitler and Mussolini were giving money, weapons, troops, etc., to Franco and his forces, the Falange. Britain and France sat on their thumbs, okay? It actually did more than that, closed the borders. So that even if you wanted out of the hell, you couldn't get out. Soviet Union stepped in, and for whatever reasons, and I'm going to give Stalin a bad lick here because I think he sucked, but they gave help to the Spanish Republic. They were the only country that would. But at the same time, they didn't do it. This wasn't a pro bono effort, folks. This wasn't, hey, I'm doing you a good thing just because I'm a good guy. This was, I want something in return. And what he wanted was power in Spain. So the Communist Party essentially took over the Popular Front in the Madrid government in the Republic and put down the opposition, because the opposition was calling the Popular Front was calling for, let's win the war, which was a good thing to call for because we needed to defeat Franco. But the POUM, and the FAI, the anarchists, were calling, we want a social revolution to go along with this. We don't stop at just winning the war. We create a new society while we are doing it. The Stalinists would hear none of that. And so they took after their opposition and eliminated the POUM, eliminated to a large extent the FAI, the anarchists in Spain. So just a little more background on that. So Orwell was correct.
Yeah. Thank you.
Are there any comments from the phone, Andy?
Yeah, so far this has been, like I said, my first exposure to this group. As far as the comment about whether our current electoral process or a direct action is more preferable or better than the other, the way I see it, and this may be a very simplistic answer, I'm not quite as learned as most of the people on this call right now, but the way I see it, it's a sort of a cart before the horse situation. I believe right now that our current electoral options are not a feasible route for change right now. So at that point, I feel that direct action is probably the main way that we could develop any sort of sway or power over the capitalist class. And it's going to be very difficult because technically we have the numbers, but right now they have the organization, and they're smaller and they're very well protected in their wealth. So it's going to be a long haul. I see this as sort of a battle of attrition over time. And ultimately it comes down to the main enemies are ourselves. It comes down to human nature. I mean, I've been sort of a student of philosophy and sociology a lot of my life, and I've just been getting into the more of the political side of this thing. I've become more of an enthusiastic student as of late. I turned my speaker off, so I'm not feeding back here. And I like I said, I do see this as a long road. As to the thoughts about, is violence inevitable when it comes to this sort of a change, a social change. The fact that I don't believe there's been a whole lot of a social evolution in humanity in general for the past several centuries, it may take a long period of time before that change can happen, and that more people will be open to change. I mean, again, we're fighting human nature on a large scale at this point. But I do want to be part of a solution with that, and I would like to be a part of the multi-generational battle that's coming up on this thing. And as far as any questions, I don't really have any at this point. Like I said, I'm just sort of starting the journey on this thing. But I want to thank you all very much for everything that's been said here today, and it's been a learning experience. Thank you.
That's awesome. Yeah,
Thank you, Evan.
I think the ages on this phone call are pretty diverse, so it's awesome to be in this multi-generational group. I think that's a good thing. Bob, would you be able to ask the last question and then we can wrap up?
I didn't really have a question. I wanted to respond to Michael's comments more so than anything else. I kind of wanted to clarify, kind of clarify some things, at least from the point of view of the IWW, and as far as direct action goes. I think that the direct action examples that you brought up, Michael, were great. They're absolutely, they changed the dynamics of thought and moved the Overton window a little bit. Substantially, actually. I mean, when we're seeing people like AOC get elected and the Bernie movement, but and I can't speak for other syndicalist or syndicalist type organizations. The IWW has a big debate going on within itself itself about whether we're even syndicalists, because industrial unionism is the big push. But as far as direct action goes, I mean, the IWW, where there are a lot of IWW members that participated in all of those direct actions, the IWW doesn't focus on that sort of direct action. The direct action that we're more interested in is on-the-job direct action. And my thought about the violence is anytime you start threatening the bourgeoisie's status, they're going to violently retaliate. But direct action can be as simple as a shop that is organized. And this is a real example. A shop was organized and there was a piece of equipment that was dangerous, and the shop got together and they decided they were going to do something about it, and they appropriated the funds and they replaced that machine. And that's another form of direct action. The thinking behind that kind of organizing is that is the kind of education that the IWW is more proposing, more than like a political ideology. It's to show the working class that we actually do have the power. And it's like a direct action education, so that, you know, the more gains and wins that a certain shop can have, the more people on that shop floor are going to realize we are the ones that are making this work. And I don't know if that, I just wanted to clarify that direct action doesn't necessarily have to come up against like tanks.
One would hope.
Yeah.
I made a mistake and I thought this ended at 2:30, but apparently it ends at 3. Is that correct?
Well, yes, it did technically, but we don't have to run that long if people don't have any questions. I do have some closing remarks I'd like to make.
We do still have Michelle, Scott, and Hayden on stack.
Okay, go for it.
Michelle?
Yeah, sure. So just going back to the discussion questions, kind of exploring, you know, if direct action would produce better results than electoral work, and, you know, how should we achieve workers' control, direct action, or legislation? I think it's twofold. I think, you know, it's a difficult uphill battle to win electorally, but in the recent book, Bigger Than Bernie by Megan Day and Micah Utrecht, they wrote that mass numbers of people are going to treat elections as the main arena for their political frustrations and aspirations, at least for the time being. These are objective conditions over which we have no control. And the question we must face is whether we join them in the democratic sphere, giving socialist and class struggle character to fights playing out in the electoral arena, or sit those fights out and miss the opportunity to engage with people by getting in the ring ourselves. And I do think that's pretty key. I don't think we just want to cede the ground of electoral politics to just a liberal perspective on the left, and that we should keep bringing a class struggle approach and mindset to it. And the reason why, from my mind, you know, electoralism and, you know, direct action in the workplace are twofold is when you look at recent strikes, when you look at the West Virginia's teacher strikes, which I think was brought up earlier, a lot of the rank and file activists who were behind the scenes working on that, I think one or two came from either the DSA, or the Bernie campaign. And, you know, it's kind of that militant minority rank and file organizing that I think that was able to bring about radicalizing for the West Virginia teacher strikes. I also think that when you look at DSA chapters' involvement with other teacher strikes around the country, such as Chicago and Oakland, or with the East Bay DSA, and their involvement with Bread for Ed campaigns, supporting strikes and assisting the teachers and the community in that way by providing food for the students who were out of class and therefore might not be able to get food, and, you know, bolstering the strike fund. I think a lot of DSA's growth has come from electoral action, and that's what really enables us to, you know, help fight in that arena and provide direct support to the workers in their struggles. So I definitely think both, electoral action and, direct workplace action are key. And, through DSA, I think, considering a rank and file strategy, having socialists take, roles in key industries to help kind of sow that connection between the left and labor are just some important things to consider.
Scott is next.
Yeah, so obviously I've got a lot of things to talk about, be it Catalonia, Khrushchev, and human nature and all of that. But I want to address first and foremost this this divide between politics and economics. It's a false divide. It's not real. Any Marxist will tell you that Marx talked about political economy. It was politics and economics are the same thing. They're just the same thing. It's just we think about it in a modern sphere of them as being two very different things because that's what liberalism does. It atomizes and individualizes these things. But Marx talked about political economy because politics and economics are not two different things. They are one thing. And regarding the electoral sphere and all of that, when political work is good at activating people who are not class conscious. It is good at approaching the backward section of the working class and saying, hey, guys, you can take control of your own destiny. And getting them to become politically active and become more in mind of that things can change over time in with the the dialect in mind with the dialectic. Like when I look at the map of District 2, it's the most important areas on that map are not just well, that's getting into the violence part, but yeah, the point I was trying to make was that it's called political economy for a reason. These aren't two different things.
May I comment on that briefly, if possible? Sure. You're right, Scott. It's called political economy for a reason. The two are not inseparable. They're one and the same. It's how you define politics. And I think the question here is a recognition that electoral politics is not always the end-all and be-all, especially under a capitalist regime in a bourgeois democracy. So
absolutely,
politics is about power. And you're engaging in politics when you're dealing with grappling for power. So it's very political. Syndicalism is not a non-political movement. It's a very political movement because it seeks power on behalf of society and the working class in particular. So I'll give you that. And I'm having a senior moment. There was another point I wanted to make and it just blew by me, so forget it. Move on.
Hayden?
Hi, I think this is a really excellent discussion. I'm here to kind of address the where should electoral work feature and how viable is prominently direct action strategy. I think like everybody, the comments here, I think have been very excellent. I think a lot of what our chapter has done, especially through the DSA for Bernie work, has been to engage smartly with electoral work where there's an excitement, kind of an entry point for people who don't spend all their time on politics and all their time thinking about it. It's an entryway. And I think in that way, electoral politics is a feeder for the other work. And it's necessary to, I don't think a strategy of solely direct action, not that anyone is proposing that, but I just don't think that's viable in the current moment. But I do think it plays a necessary role, especially I consider labor work a separate category, and I consider labor work one of our prominent areas of class struggle that I hope we can engage more deeply in. But frankly, like electoral politics is a lower barrier to entry point than something like union work or rank and file strategy, taking jobs. So I think as a matter of strategic necessity to continue to grow the organization and bring in new members, electoral work is a necessary battlefront that we have to fight on. And I think there are a lot of good comrades attempting to fight that fight, especially like in the call campaign, it's an ongoing battle. I think there's a discussion to be had about, where to center that work. And I think we're still having that discussion within the chapter. And I think it's a very, I think everybody's trying to push very hard everywhere they can and take their work very seriously. And that's something I really appreciate about our chapter, is the level of dedication that I've seen out of a lot of members. So to round it all out, I think that direct action in the long term is incredibly necessary, because they will, even if we democratically win, there's the use of violent force, as in Allende's Chile. But I think we have a long way to go before we're at the scale of that movement. And so we need to deal with the terrain as it exists. And that's all I'll say on that.
Daniel's next.
I've been listening. We went on a walk and it was super windy, and I just got like a pound of like pollen in my nose. Didn't feel great, but I'm feeling better now.
Good luck.
Yeah, Hayden, I basically was just going to say what you said, but I'll add maybe one or two things. Scott, you said that electoral work sort of activates the class consciousness of people that don't really have a class consciousness. And I think you're totally right. I think that I would add on to that, but that's most people, right? And so when Hayden talks about it being a low barrier of entry, that's the, it's a pretty wide net, right? Because most people don't have a sort of class consciousness, or most people don't have politics in any thoroughgoing sort of rigorous sense, right? When we talk about like the political ideas of like the average person, well, it's just like a smattering of more or less incoherent things, which is fine. It would be wonderful if we had a world in which not everyone had to worry about politics as much as we all do, because we had just systems in place. So to say electoralism just activates people's class consciousness, that's huge actually, because most people don't have class consciousness. And then I think that there's a little bit of a distinction to be made perhaps in the intention that one has when one undertakes sort of electoral work or direct action work. And that is to say that the upshot to both of those things can be the same, which is you're building the organization, you're sort of laying the foundational work for these left-wing organizations, which is to say, if DSA is growing and activating members and people are getting involved in all kinds of stuff, then however those people are getting involved, like that was effective, right? And some people will get activated through electoral work, some people will get activated through direct action work. But at the end of the day, you have to have people. You have to have a mass of people, way more people than we have now. And whatever's bringing them in is worthwhile. So there's sort of
as long as it's moral.
As long as it's moral, yeah, sure. So I think the idea that you're only doing electoralism work for the sole purpose of getting these people elected and using power is misguided, because that's not why we do it. It's always with an eye towards also organization building. And same with direct action. Any direct action that you're undertaking isn't solely for the upshot of whatever that direct action produces. It also is building the organization. So as long as that sort of is, I think, held in your mind, I think that it makes the distinctions important, but it makes the differences important, but it makes them not perhaps as divisive or as zero sum, maybe as I think some people sometimes think of them. And that's what I have to say about that.
Looks like Evan's next.
All right. I just kind of wanted to touch on what everyone was talking about, because it, I don't necessarily think just because one party doesn't want to do the political process and the other one does, that necessarily that they should be adjacent from each other. Because recently, I just actually finished a book by Richard Wolff called Understanding Socialism. And at the end, of course, like all socialist economists, there we go, he always has his idea of where everyone should go from here. And he had an interesting theory of, instead of going into the political realm, one should go into the economic realm. And the way he suggested this was by starting more co-ops and more places like Mondragon Company. And if you don't know what Mondragon is, it's this worker co-op, which is now the 7th largest company in Spain. And his suggestion was that more socialists should start doing that in response to spreading more socialism to countries. And so in my opinion, and I would like just to get feedback on this as well, I don't think necessarily one should be excluded. I think in a way it's more of a two-pronged attack, if you will, because one is taking on the political side of the nature, and the other is taking on an economic side of the nature. And I would think syndicalists would value something like a co-op or something that would kind of build on that, as well as something like Winco, where the owners own stocks and everything. And that was kind of like a general idea / philosophy question that I just wanted to pose to the group and wanted to get everyone's reaction to.
Daniel?
Not to jump in here all of a sudden, but I'll speak to that a little bit, just because I work for what's essentially an airsoft co-op that will eventually be a co-op. So I'm a shoe repairman at like a family-owned business. And when the whole COVID-19 crisis hit, basically the 5 millennials who work there banded together and then just told our 2 bosses, who are a brother and sister, and they're like in their 60s, like, hey, there's 5 of us, there's 2 of you, so like this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna flatten everyone's pay scale and all this stuff. And my boss is like, oh, well, okay, I guess that's what we're doing. So we sort of like unintentionally formed a union, I guess. But my boss is retiring in 2 years, and his son's taking over, and his son is like more left-wing than me. He's an SA. And so the 2 of us are going to run it as a co-op. And so like we've talked with an accountant and a lawyer about kind of how we do that. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is how, yeah, exactly what you're saying, that it's sort of a proof of concept, like, because people sort of learn their politics intuitively. They sort of absorb it through their skin in a way. And if you're going to a place that is a well-run business that you enjoy going to, it's sort of an institution of the neighborhood, like a good bakery, or there's like some game designers that have like anarchist run like things, and they produce like really good video games and stuff. Things that are sort of well-run organizations that are also democratic organizations, like, is a very good proof of concept for people, because it's sort of that is political education. And we talk all the time about our our sort of dream is to eventually have what amounts to like a left-wing chamber of commerce on our street in Wallingford, because we're like, man, every cafe should be owned and democratically run and all this stuff. And that is, you know, another way of doing essentially what we're talking about. And it kind of dovetails with what Scott said. Like, politics and economics are the same thing in a lot of ways, and they're very much the same thing in that sense, right? And that it just sort of shows up organically and naturally to people that the concept works. And I see Scott's comment that it's a capitalist framework, and yeah, you're still like engaging in a sort of monetary system or whatever, I guess. But I don't know, baby steps is what I'll say to that. And also that would be a wonderful problem to have if we got to the point where, you know, we could worry about such things. But you know, you gotta do what you can. You gotta the low hanging fruit is still fruit, you know. Don't ignore the low hanging fruit just because it's in front of your face.
So it looks like we've got 3 minutes left. Gray, can you give your comments? And then Scott, if they're brief after that.
Might help if I am muted.
Gray.
Sorry about that. I keep writing the mute button, going in and out of places. So as someone who is kind of deeply engaged in electoral politics, I have to concur with Scott. You know, they're both, you know, economy and politics are the same. And I only responded in the chat saying, what does it mean to be against electoral politics? I mean, I guess the question could be to Bob, or it could be really to the whole room. What does it exactly mean? Where's the opposition there? Is that borne out from actual experience, or is it just a doctrinarial, like saying, well, this can't ever work because it's never worked, when we've had like pretty, I mean, not as huge amount of electoral success, I will admit. I mean, I'm going against a arch capitalist as a campaign manager against a monstrous man by the name of Rick Larson. And, you know, it's difficult. It's not easy work. And it's kind of like, when I hear somebody who's against electoral politics, it's not a personal judgment or upsetness of the person saying that, but maybe I'm just not understanding why we would see that particular battlefield against the capitalist class in that sense. Now, I love the Wobblies, are amazing. I love them so much. That's one of the points of like syndicalism I'm not like quite familiar with as to the reason of why. Maybe Bob or maybe Randall, I don't know.
Bob or Randall, do you want to respond before Scott?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. Hey, great beat. For the Wobs originally, remember when they originally organized, they had just come off 10 years earlier, the busting of the American Railway Union by federal troops. You had National Guard and often federal troops intervening on behalf of employers to break strikes. So politicians were looked at with rather a jaundiced view, from a jaundiced viewpoint. You also had the courts stepping in. Injunctions were widespread. They weren't outlawed until the 30s. So the whole system was rigged against direct working class action. And it didn't appear that working through actually the earlier movements, the Socialist Party had been harassed. The Populist Party in the 1890s had been harassed or eventually bought off, in effect. But so there was a real jaundiced view. So it was a tactical and a strategic decision at that time. I think it still has merit, but again, it has to be based. And I wanted to be when we closed, I just had one or two short remarks to make. Maybe I should make them now. When we're talking about electoral politics, so someone said, I think it was you, Scott, that politics was a way to organize people. I think it's a way to mobilize people. Organization of people is another thing entirely. And I think we need to keep that distinction in mind, because it's our job to organize them. Politics is there to mobilize them and to educate them to some extent. We need to carry that forward through organization. So that's just, but again, to Gray's point in particular, I'm somewhat of a syndicalist. I'm not totally there. I'm not totally not there. But if we elect people to office, we must elect organizers to office. It must be understood, if we elect a socialist to office, that socialist is a self-identified and publicly identified socialist. That socialist adheres to our values and pursues them. And that socialist is an organizer. He organizes his constituency. That is his or her job. His or her job is not to make bargains with the bosses. His or her job is not to get reelected. His or her job is to organize the community to make a better world. I'll leave it at that.
I think we got one last comment from Scott. Oh, actually, I think Bob was directly addressed with the IWW. So Bob, can you address that?
I just wanted to comment about talking about against electoralism or not. So personally, I'm not against electoral politics. I think it would have been great had Bernie been nominated. And I think there are absolutely gains to be made electorally. But as far as direct action versus electoralism, I kind of view it takes a lot of work to get someone elected that can affect a minor change in our current government. And, you know, had Bernie been elected president, it would have taken a lot of work on top of just that election to force the rest of the government to go along and the rest of the capitalist class to go along. And so I personally, and this is just my personal opinion, I'm not gonna speak for everyone. Personally, I believe that if there are changes that you can make directly at your workplace without appealing to an authority, it's more, that is political. That is seizing power. That's power within the workplace. And, you know, the workplace is, you know, we talk about having a democracy when it's actually a republic, but politics is power. And whether that's in the workplace or at the municipal level or county level or federal level, it's kind of like, you know, this direct action is very political.
Thanks, Bob. Scott, you're next.
Looks like I still have enough time. Okay, so I was, obviously there's still a lot to talk about, but one thing that was on my mind throughout all of this is how is it that if you're going to build a new society on all of this, how is it that the syndicalist councils, how do they like functionally interact with one another?
That would be for them to decide. I can't give you a satisfactory answer to that stuff. I'm not there. So I think it was Bob, or maybe it was Evan, who brought up the Mondragon cooperative complex in Spain. I was going to speak to them. You stole my thunder, darn you. But they've been around for 30 years and they've been very successful. And if you look closely at how they operate and cooperate, It may give you an answer to that question. I would look also to something. It was flawed because it was run from the top down by the party in Belgrade. But the workers' councils, the worker self-management organization in Yugoslavia, before the dissolution of the Yugoslavian Socialist Republic. And but again, it was very flawed, but it was an initial attempt to integrate worker-directed, worker-run production in the economy. And I think we have a great American historian who studied the steel industry in particular for a number of years, who's now deceased, David Montgomery, in his book, Workers' Control in America. I think all our comrades would find that. It's not too long, and it does deal directly with the steel industry. I'll just be upfront about that. But it raises some major issues on how workers took it upon themselves to organize the pace of work, the fashion of work, health and safety rules, cooperation amongst teams within factories. I just recommend it to folks.
I think that will wrap us up really nicely. Randall, do you have any other final comments?
Oh, a couple things. Well, we've already talked a little bit about Mondragon. So thank you, Evan, for that. In Spain, I was going to encourage people to go to their website and examine how they operate as a way regional cooperatives can work together to make a democratically operated and thriving industrial complex. I also didn't raise the issue. There was a reaction to syndicalism called criminal syndicalism, and a number of states, especially at the beginning of World War I, introduced statutes. Washington State, for example, had a criminal syndicalism statute, which said if you're a syndicalist, you're a criminal. And but it was so broad that the Supreme Court in Washington, a year later, it went into effect in 1916. In 1917, it was struck down by the Washington State Supreme Court as being way too broad. And let's be honest, folks, there was nothing to save society here. It was an attempt to crush the IWW and workers' organizations in Washington State who opposed the war. So thank you all for joining. I think I've learned a lot, and I certainly appreciate your attention and your great comments. And it gives me lots of things I can consider. And my final statement is solidarity, brothers and sisters, and stay safe, stay home.
Thanks. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.